most of the terrible big diseases in human history, malaria, tuberculosis, smallpox, they all start as animal diseases. I mean, every disease comes from somewhere. Diseases are always moving between animal hosts, but they mostly evolve the ability to spread directly between humans. Plague is really weird in that it never does that. So it can spread between humans for a little bit, but not for long. It is truly a wild animal disease. And it never becomes a human disease. It's still out there. And one of the reasons we can never get rid of plague is because it's not a human disease. It lives in wild rodents in Central Asia, in Madagascar, in the United States West, in the Rocky Mountains. Don't pet the prairie dogs. Certainly don't eat the prairie dogs. They've got plague and they can give it to you. So it lives permanently in wild rodents. And somehow at different times in history, it has spilled out of those wild rodent populations. And it does so when it gets into the kinds of rodents that live in human habitats. And we can hardly imagine, we still have lots of rodents. There's more rodents than you want to know living in and around everywhere that we live. But in the past, it was even more unbelievable. They didn't have, pesticides. They didn't have the kinds of sealants that we have. They were surrounded, particularly by black rats. And the black rat is very susceptible to this disease. And so the human pandemics happen when a wild rodent disease gets into our commensal rodents, the rodents that live in and around our houses, and then they all die, and their fleas are, they're as hungry as you or me, and they want supper. And when they don't have any more rat blood to eat, they lower their standards and they're willing to drink human blood, and they hop to us and infect us with bubonic plague.
There's that in Camus' La Peste, which is one of the greatest pieces of literature about plague. It starts with a rat dying and another rat dying. And it's just funny, you don't really associate just rat dying with the imminence of human death. And that's fascinating that it's literally because these fleas are hungry because they've killed off their hosts. And they just randomly looking around, what else can I get? And there's a human lying down with rats living in his house or her house, and let alone the latrines, the lack of sanitation. And there's something kind of amazing to me about the fact that they didn't understand this. And so readers should know I've just been diagnosed with pneumonia, another classic. And that, of course, when that breaks out in the 6th century, as Rome is struggling to retain its power and grip in Europe, would really knock its military for six, would really put pressure on its economy. And in your telling, was a kind of critical turning point in the ability of the Roman Empire to survive. It was just kind of the last thing that tipped it over because they just couldn't sustain the kind of levels of military engagement particularly in Germany and Europe, Northern Europe, that they had previously been able to. Is that a fair summary of what you think might have happened?
I think it is. And if you'll indulge me, I want to go back 1 second to the Please. Rats and the biology of plague, because you said something earlier that I loved about how the way I put it in the book is it's a microbes world. I mean, we're just part of this crazy world of living things on Earth that have been created by evolution. And it's all so weird. And the plague is this really weird disease, and it just never stops ceasing to amaze me. But it gets even weirder than we've said, because the plague bacterium has evolved to be incredibly good at sort of taking over the fleas. And the plague bacteria actually, they work as a team to block up the gut of the flea. And so the flea is really dying. It's starving. It's incredibly hungry. And so it just starts ravenously feeding. So the bacteria kind of turn the flea into a zombie germ-spreading bloodsucker. And it really, we can actually now sort of see the evolutionary mechanisms of this. The plague is such a weird product of nature, which is always out there trying these weird experiments. 99.99999% to infinity of these experiments fail but there's so many microbes that are constantly experimenting. And we've learned this with COVID, that these variants, COVID is, every time it infects one of us, it's mutating over and over and over. And most of the mutations do nothing or make the virus a little bit worse. But unfortunately, 1 out of every trillion of those tiny little genetic changes will change the shape of the molecule on the virus that will make it better at latching onto our cells or fighting off our immune system. So evolution is really weird. Plague is one of its really weird creations.